Hello, this is IT team number 26, and we'll be discussing our vulnerability assessment of our extreme funding environment. And this discussion is mostly geared towards our senior officers who are unavailable at the moment locally. So to begin with, what we mean by overall assessment is essentially it's going to be a summarized version of our comprehensive assessment that is attached to our report. So essentially, this will be just going a general overview of what we found for our Linux machines, our Windows computers, and our router. Additionally, any services that are tied to those computers or machines. First of all, will be the Linux computers, and we'll be looking at common vulnerabilities and exposures, otherwise known as CVEs. For those who do not know, a CVE is essentially a threat that could be posed on the user, the operating system, or a service being run on the operating system. General CVEs that we found on our Linux machines will be things such as default credentials, meaning that they all shared the same password and usernames for the highest level user, meaning that if a hacker man were to find our passwords, we would pretty much be unable to defend it at that point because every other machine uses the same credentials. And we resolved this later on, so don't worry. Additionally, we found additional CVEs on Toonami. This is just an example of that specific machine. This is specifically one geared to SSH, which is a secure shell, and that's how we remote into Linux machines. So looking at the screenshot to the bottom left, we can see that there's an exploit package. There is CVEs for 2019-6111. And additionally, if we were to look closely, there is a 1337-day-ID-32328, as long as with another 1337-day exploit. For those who are not in the loop, 1337 is common hacker phrase for this thing called lead. So it's kind of just a sign for them, meaning that there was an exploit here present, and this exploit also occurred within our Apache HTTPD CVE on Toonami. For those who do not know what Apache is, it's essentially used to fund our website, meaning that we had an exploit on our website, but we also mitigate those later on. Additionally, a lot of them tend to be running on outdated operating systems and package managers, meaning that they would not necessarily have the latest security in terms of operating systems. So we'll discuss on how we resolve that later. Next up will be Windows computers. Windows, we noticed that on Sailor Moon, which is actually our legacy Windows operating system, which is running Windows XP, tend to have the most vulnerabilities. Meaning that, for instance, this FileZilla CVE at the bottom left, you can see that there are, of course, exploit packages. There are packet storms for another exploit, and there's also cloud bursts for exploits as well. And this also occurred similar to the Apache CVE on our Sailor Moon. So we are essentially trying to highlight what are the common forms of exploits that could occur within our environment. Additionally, the SMBV1 outdated one affects mostly our servers. For those who do not know, SMBV1 is essentially standing for Simple Messaging Block, and it's just a protocol that's used for Windows servers, specifically for domain controllers, which are computers that control other Windows computers, and also Active Directory, which is just our user directory, whether it's our employee or customer. So that's a very, very aggressive CVE. Next up would be our router. Main issue is that we had default credentials on it. We also had SSH enabled. Now, SSH is not necessarily a flaw within pfSense. However, and pfSense being our router, of course, it's just that we want to limit the amount of access we give to our firewall, which is why we decided to list it as a CVE. Additionally, we had an outdated operating system as usual. Now, those were the general problems. Now, we'll discuss on how we resolve those issues. For Linux computers, we began by updating the operating system and package managers. We also changed credentials. In addition to that, we also decided to upgrade our firewall by configuring things such as uncomplicated firewall, known as UFW, and firewall D to filter our network traffic. For Windows, we decided to update the operating systems as usual, change credentials, and we decided to update SMBV1 to SMVB2 because SMVB2 doesn't have the same issue as SMVB1, which is the exploit known as Eternal Blue. And as I stated before, Eternal Blue is essentially a threat to the domain controller and Active Directory by giving an unauthorized user access to those services. And so by updating our SMBV1 to SMBV2, we essentially hardened our domain controller and Active Directory. So we don't need to worry about unauthorized access within our machines or unauthorized access to our users directory, nor our own employee directory. Additionally, there was a file that did not need to be there. It was simply a logging file on our Sailor Moon machine. And so we simply disabled that task and removed the file. That file has its own independent incident response form for further information. Lastly would be our router. Our router was mostly fixed by updating the operating system, which is pfSense. We also installed a rootkit checker. Essentially, a rootkit is a type of attack that will allow an unauthorized user immediate admin privileges. So we installed a rootkit checker to always check if there was an installation of that to occur. If there is, then it will alert us and we could just remove that user immediately. Additionally, we enabled further firewall rules on our external connection to deter threat, meaning that it's a lot harder for someone outside our network to go inside. Additionally, we disabled the default administrator account and just replaced it with our own. So we didn't necessarily change credentials. We just changed the user and disabled that user entirely. Lastly, we want to discuss moving forward, as in like, what can we improve on? Since we want to insist on the highest standards for extreme funding. Centralized logging. This is an example of a service we would like to use, such as Graylog. Mainly, it allows us to view an overall, to give us an overall environment overview. So it could check our Windows machine, Linux machines, or routers, anything logs with it, such as user authentication, editing a file, access to a service. Furthermore, since we have those information, we could detect threats with it. Maybe we had an attack disable a service that we needed. Graylog should be able to pick it up. We could file an incident report using the evidence, and we could file that hacker to the proper authorities. Additionally, we would like to include more of our intrusion detection system, which is essentially how we detect threats, and intrusion prevention system which is how we stop those threats from continuing on. And a common way is to do Snort, which we are actually including now. So Snort actively scans the network for unauthorized net access, and obviously an IDS will detect the intrusion whilst the IPS will actively try to prevent it. And we're mainly going to be using Snort since it's free and available for pfSense. Overall, that is the entire presentation. So thank you all for listening. Hopefully you have a wonderful day. For any further information, please feel to reach out to me or the team. And additionally, there is always the write-up available to be read. Thank you very much.